Now I'd like to welcome to the show Erica York, Senior Economist and Research Director with the Tax Foundation's Center for Federal Tax Policy. Welcome to Free the Economy, Erica.
Thanks for having me on, Richard.
So people ask me why we've been doing so much tax and budget stuff here on the show recently, and it's because we are approaching an especially important time when a lot of important decisions are going to be made in Congress that are going to affect us for the next several years. And most importantly, many, but I believe not all, of the major provisions of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the big tax bill from Trump 1.0, a lot of those are going to be expiring soon. And there's a lot of people in Washington who don't want them to expire. So there's a lot of work to be done. Uh, so can you give us just a real quick kind of micro lesson on where the TCJA came from and why it's expiring and it wasn't permanent?
Yeah, for sure. So the TCGA debates actually go back almost a decade. If anyone has heard of the camp draft, that was one of the, well, several drafts in 2014 around then that came out and really pushed for the need for tax reform because our corporate tax code was becoming very out of date with the rest of the world. While the rest of the world slowly marched down to corporate tax rates in the mid 20s, the US maintained a worldwide 35% corporate tax rate. So the way we treated multinational companies was out of step with the rest of the world, and the rate we applied to all corporations was out of step. So that was the real big need for tax reform, and that's what the TCJA ultimately addressed. And it also combined with that reforms and cuts on the individual side. So if we looked at what was permanent in the TCJA, it was the corporate tax cut, some other corporate-based broadeners, and changes to our international tax system to move more towards like a hybrid territorial system. We still have elements of worldwide taxation for certain types of income, but for the most part, we have just a territorial tax system. And then on the individual side, it cut taxes, it changed the structure of benefits for taxpayers with children. So increased the child tax credit, got rid of personal exemptions. It placed limitations on itemized deductions. It curbed the alternative minimum tax. It significantly increased the estate tax exemption. So all of these changes significantly cut taxes and significantly simplified the income tax system that people face. But all of those individual changes will sunset after the end of 2025. So our tax system will revert back to what it was starting on January 1, 2026. But for the most part, the corporate changes will remain in place. Some of them are also scheduled to tighten over that time. Some deductions for business investment are scheduled to worsen over that time. So there are changes on the business side too.
But in the initial negotiation over this, is the understanding that they sort of couldn't get enough votes to make everything permanent, so it was sort of a negotiation to say, well, we'll have it for the next several years, and then we'll have to come back and vote again.
Yeah, so they used the reconciliation process, which places a bunch of limits on the deficit impact. So the instructions permitted them to increase the deficit by $1.5 trillion within the 10-year budget window. But outside of the budget window, you can't have a permanent increase in deficits. So that either requires you to do revenue neutral permanent tax reform. So you make changes to rates, but you also make changes to the base. So you're not changing revenues. Or to get around that, you can sunset things. And that's ultimately what ended up happening for the individual side. You can also look at, if you look at the first draft, like take the House GOP blueprint back in 2016, they were really shooting for the moon with like fundamental revenue neutral tax reform, completely changing the way that we tax business income, significantly simplifying the individual system, like not just placing limitations on itemized deductions, getting rid of them, not just reducing rates, but moving to an individual tax system with just like three brackets instead of seven, fully getting rid of the AMT, fully getting rid of the estate tax. And then through that legislative process, of course, things get watered down. You have to make compromises. And so that's how we ended up with what we got, which was an improvement on the status quo, but it wasn't the like shoot for the moon tax reform.
Right. And so coming back in January, we have a Republican trifecta, right? We have Donald Trump as the Republican president. We have Republican majorities in the House and the Senate. Uh, so now would be a time on paper for Republicans to be pretty ambitious, right? Um, so is it fair to say that, based on everything you've heard, that a major tax bill is going to be a top priority, if not the top priority for Republicans in the 119th Congress?
Absolutely. And I think we'll see action on it in 2025. That's my sense. Um, and I think we'll be using reconciliation again. So that means we'll face some of those same constraints as far as long-term changes in the deficit. So anything that is done permanently has to be quote unquote paid for, or has to be, revenue neutral. So my hope is that that makes lawmakers really rethink, not necessarily rethink everything of the TCJ, but go back to that initial draft and say, what can we do that's more fundamental? What can we do that, doesn't just simplify things here and there, but fully simplifies things. Of course, the same political constraints will be at play, so we'll likely get some compromise version. But yeah, tax is going to be one of the top things on the agenda because of that expiration date at the end of next year.
So this time around, I mean, in the first Trump administration, TCJA was really one of his signature domestic policy achievements and something he leaned into really heavily. Uh, this time it looks like it's not, the Trump White House and Trump, team won't just be wanting those permanent tax provisions or those temporary tax provisions made permanent or extended, because he on the campaign trail has said that he wants to see other things like ending the cap on state and local tax deduction, or eliminating taxes on Social Security income, or on taxes on tips. And actually, Harris and Trump both sort of endorsed that at one point during the campaign. Um, how much more complicated does that make things, um, between just saying, well, we want the 2017 tax changes to be, we want to push those forward and keep having them, but we also want to have all this other stuff too that has become apparently a priority in the meantime.
It makes the budget math very tricky. So if you look at, our score at Tax Foundation of what it costs to make the TCJ permanent or the Congressional Budget Office score, it'll reduce revenue somewhere north of $4 trillion over the budget window. And that's just like maintaining status quo. If you add all of these other things that Trump proposed on the campaign trail, it could very easily get north of $8 trillion over the 10-year budget window. That's before counting any offsets that he proposed as well. So I think it really complicates the debate. It's already going to be a tough lift just to get like extension of the TCJ. If you almost, double the tax cuts that you're trying to push through, I think that's impossible. And it complicates, what do we prioritize? I get the kind of like political appeal of doing that though, because just to an everyday taxpayer, continuing the status quo is not going to feel like a tax cut. Like if my
Right.
taxes stay the same in 2026 as they were in 2025, and you try to message to me like, "Hey, we cut your taxes," I say, "Well, no, I don't think you did. I'm just paying the same thing I always did." So I get the appeal to add more on top of it because then it really will feel like a tax cut to people, but that does make the budget math really tough.
And there's some sort of kind of technical aspects to this as well, which is like when you said passing legislation like this, quote, through reconciliation, the idea that this is sort of a fast track way of getting things through Congress. You can get them through with only 50 votes and not like 60 votes in the Senate. And but that process is constrained. You can't just pass anything through there. There's a bunch of rules. And one of them, so for one of these kind of additional tax changes that Trump has proposed this time that weren't around last time, the changing how retirees get taxed on Social Security benefits. I understand that that is something that the reconciliation process does not support. You can't change Social Security via reconciliation.
That's right. Yeah, you're prevented from doing anything that impacts Social Security. So that would get like birded out. I think is the term they would use because of the bird rule. So that particular tax cut, which is somewhere north of $1 trillion over the decade, would be off the table. Yeah.
As part of that, the package.
If it was done through reconciliation, yeah, could totally
Okay.
be done separately, but then would require that higher vote threshold.
Right. Now, Trump, of course, one of the probably economic policies he's best known for is very bullish on trade tariffs. And so he's talked about using tariffs, of course, deploying them strategically as a tool for trade negotiations with potentially with the long-term goal of not having them anymore, but using them as a threat to get a better deal with various trade partners. But he's also talked about, and some of his people have talked about using them as a long-term source of just federal revenue. Like we'll just have them, we'll have like a 10% tariff on everything forever, and that'll just, bring all this revenue into the treasury, and that's great. Uh, so I know at Tax Foundation, you guys have looked at this. What does your research tell you about the sort of like macro effects here of this? We're talking about this like revenue balance versus the deficit, uh, in terms of the volume of tax cuts that the incoming administration wants to either extend or expand versus what kind of revenue the federal government would be bringing in from tariffs.
Yeah. There are a lot of conflicts in the way that various folks in the incoming Trump administration have spoken about tariffs and how they could potentially be deployed. But if we're talking tariffs for revenue, tariffs end up being a very inefficient way to raise revenue. First, they're a tax in and of themselves that encourages inefficient production. So they protect some domestic industries, which increases capital, workers flowing to those industries, but that's coming out of industries that are currently productive without tariffs. So you're decreasing allocative efficiency, or you're decreasing the productivity of the U.S. economy, and you increase relative prices. The effect of that is to reduce people's real after-tax income, after you take into account the effect of the tariff on the economy. So that means overall less output, lower wages, fewer jobs. And then the part that really sets tariffs apart as being an inefficient way to raise revenue is that they invite foreign retaliation. So you don't just have the harmful effect of the tax on the U.S. economy, you have the compounding harmful effect of foreign countries placing taxes on U.S. exports. That comes with a cost for that foreign country imposing the tariff, just like when we impose a tariff, it comes with a cost to our economy, but it also lowers U.S. export sales. So that means our export industries lose income, lose sales, lose jobs as well. So for that reason, it's not a good way to offset the cost of tax cuts. And depending on what tax cuts we get, combined with what types of tariffs we get, we could be in a situation where the economic effects of tariffs plus retaliation outweigh the economic benefits of tax cuts. So on the effect on the economy, it's very clearly a negative. On revenue potential, even the broadest tariffs that Trump campaigned on, so the 20% universal tariff plus a 60% tariff on everything from China, would fall short of offsetting just the revenue loss of TCJA permanence, not to mention all of the other tax cuts that the Trump campaigned on.
So this sort of leads us into, I think, a kind of key theme when it comes to making these estimates about how tax and budget changes are going to, how we sort of score them, whether they're going to like increase the deficit or not. And that is about looking at this from, what people call like a static versus dynamic way, right? So if we are if we have a tax that's bringing in $1 trillion a year and we say, well, we're going to cut it by 10%, and so that's $900 billion instead. But if that change affects how people make decisions in the wider economy, then that will change the economy itself, which will then produce different numbers. So we know that big changes in tax and budget are big enough, certainly in the US federal government, are big enough to affect the wider economy. So we almost know by definition that the quote static math is not going to be reality, but there's a lot of debate about what the like corrected dynamic math is going to be. So can you tell us a little bit about that? It's usually Republicans say, "Oh, we want the dynamic scoring because that makes tax cuts look better," you know.
Yeah, I think so yeah, conventional scoring says we're going to hold the size of the macroeconomy constant and then we're going to see what this tax change does. But we know that taxes affect the macroeconomy. They affect people's decisions to work, they affect business decisions to invest, they also affect people's decisions to save. And when you change those decisions, you change the macroeconomy. And so that dynamic analysis incorporates feedback, revenue feedback. So, say you cut the corporate tax rate, but in doing so, you encourage corporations to invest more. That grows wages, that grows employment opportunities. So your corporate tax revenue is going to fall. But because you're increasing opportunities for workers, your individual and your payroll tax incomes are going to grow, and they're going to offset some of that corporate revenue loss. So that's what a dynamic score incorporates. Very, very rarely do you find that a tax cut will like fully pay for itself with that dynamic feedback, but it will offset some of that conventional revenue loss. So what we find, like for the full TCJ extension, if you made all of the individual tax cuts that are expiring, all of the estate tax cuts that are expiring, and those business investment provisions that are tightening, if you made all of those permanent instead, we find that on a dynamic basis, you would offset about 16% of the revenue loss from a conventional basis. So that does help, quote unquote, pay for the conventional score, because it factors in how the economy really will change and how revenues really will change, not with that unrealistic assumption that the economy is going to remain constant.
Right. When you look at some of these proposed changes at, Tax Foundation specifically, you have this model that does some of that like dynamic scoring, like you're talking about, but looking at whether like a tax cut will increase the deficit or not, or whether there's some of that positive feedback. But you also look at things like jobs, total hours worked in the economy. Um, what are some of those other aspects when you do a sort of a model run of someone's tax plan?
Yeah, so we can get a lot of different outputs from the model, but the ones that we typically put in an analysis will be how it affects the overall size of economic output, the overall size of American incomes measured as GNP. There can be a wedge between those two because of the effect on the deficit and the increased deficit being absorbed by foreign lending. So that means the returns to some of those assets or those interest payments are made and create a wedge between what we produce in the US versus what we earn. We also show the effect on the capital stock. So that's like the collection that we have in the US economy of like private business assets, so structures, equipment, software, IP. We look at pre-tax wages and we look at hours worked and we convert that into a full-time equivalent jobs number. Because that's just easier for people to understand like the jobs rather than like what does it mean for, a certain percentage change in hours worked. We can also, do kind of cool, like looking at how marginal tax rates on different types of income change. So, what's the tax rate at the margin on pass-through business income, on corporate income, on wage income, and look at what incentives are changing at the margin based on what type of economic activity people are engaged in.
And when we talk about pass-throughs, that's normally like small businesses where you sort of pass through the income from your small business to your individual income tax returns, right?
Yeah, yeah. So it's like LLCs, partnerships, where they're not facing the corporate entity level tax. Instead, that income is passed through to individual owners and they pay taxes on their individual tax returns. Some pass-throughs can be very large, though. So, most people think of them as small, but there are quite large pass-throughs in the US.
Mhm. Well, speaking of business people with large business interests, we have another player here that we did not have the first time around, and that is Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency, and the role that potentially people like uh, Trump advisors like Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are going to play. Um, so the two of them have proposed this idea that they are going to run this semi-unofficial government department named after a meme coin that is going to recommend all sorts of budget cuts, right? And so, we talked about, modeling the effects of a tax cut. We would say, well, if it encourages more economic growth, then it'll like sort of pay for itself, in the accounting. But these guys have said, we're going to cut actual current spending, and that's going to sort of, pay for tax cuts in effect. Um, and Elon Musk was asked, during a campaign rally, not during a like academic conference, but he was asked how much money do you think you could cut right from the federal budget? And he said, "Oh, I think I could cut $2 trillion a year." He said, and that number has been repeated many times. An aspirational number, perhaps. So if he and Vivek get together and they draw up this list of things that they're going to cut, and they say, "Oh, well, here's our $2 trillion a year of budget cuts." Um, how seriously should anyone in Congress or anyone listening to this podcast take that number?
I mean, for that number to actually be realized, Congress would have to act, and they would have to act in cutting major spending programs. You really can't find $2 trillion in like waste, fraud, and abuse, right? You would have to actually go in and reform programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Um, so I'm pretty skeptical of that number myself. I think it's to the extent that this like quasi department creates the political will for lawmakers to actually make these tough decisions and go in and reform spending, that would be good. But we have had lots of opportunities in the past, commissions. There are lots of think tank reports. There's the Government Accountability Office that has just like hundreds of recommendations Congress could implement to find cost savings, and none of that has really been acted on before. I mean, we're in a place where deficits are almost $2 trillion a year now. So unless something changes that like really makes Congress act on any of these recommendations, I don't see them going anywhere because that's the big obstacle, right?
Right. So when uh, when Congress comes back and we're looking whenever that exactly happens, I heard recently that the very first big bill was going to be something about border security and energy policy, possibly also pass the reconciliation. But whenever Congress does get to a major tax bill, uh, we have the Republicans have majorities in both houses to look at, but their House majority is going to be extremely thin, especially given that Trump has nominated a few Republican members of the House for his administration, so they'll be leaving, and there will be some time there where they will be not serving, they won't have been replaced yet. Um, so there could be a point, including at which this tax negotiations start, when the Republicans have a single vote majority, which is pretty tough. And it's tough to wrangle a for a speaker to wrangle every single member of the conference at any given time, regardless of who's in charge. So because of that, I wonder how much it will impact how much there will be an impact from one constitutional provision, which normally doesn't get talked about that often, which is in Article 1, Section 7, which says that all the revenue legislation has to originate in the House of Representatives rather than the Senate. So the tax changes have to start in the House. Uh, is that going to make any difference? Would it be easier if the Senate got to start?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very hard to get agreement in the House. Particularly, the thing that comes to mind for me is the SALT caucus. So these House Republicans that represent areas in like New York, New Jersey, California, where their constituents are upset about the $10,000 cap that the TCJA placed on the state and local tax deduction. So that there is going to be a big point of contention, and likely means that, anything that does get passed in the House is going to have a watered down salt cap. That, of course, makes the budget math harder. There's also some disagreement between the House and the Senate, I anticipate, on what the number will be, what the deficit target in reconciliation will be. And we saw this happen back in 2017 too. The House was generally in favor of something that was revenue neutral, so no increase in the deficit. The Senate was willing to increase the deficit. We're probably going to see similar fault lines again this time. So yeah, all of that is going to be difficult in the first place. And then when you look at the very slim majority in the House, that only makes it harder.
So looking at sort of bigger picture fiscal policy for the new administration, Treasury Secretary nominee, Scott Bessent, has said, and reportedly this is part of why Trump liked him and wanted to pick him for Treasury Secretary, has said that he has a 3-3-3 plan for economic success in the United States, that he wants to permanently increase long-term economic growth to 3%, to cut the budget deficit to 3% of GDP, and then increase oil production to 3 million barrels a day. Putting aside the oil part, uh, do you think we're going to see a major tax bill that's going to be consistent with those goals?
It's very difficult, especially on that deficit target, because if you look at like what that practically means, it means like reducing deficits, reducing spending or increasing revenue, some combination of that by like by the end of the budget window, like $2 trillion a year. So there's that $2 trillion number again. That's very difficult, especially if you're starting from a position of wanting to increase the deficit by $4 trillion plus through tax cuts. Now you will get some growth from those tax cuts, so it helps on that side, but that hurts on the deficit side. So again, like I think this all points to back to the drawing board. Don't just do like wholesale TCJ extension. Rethink, especially on the business side, how we can better improve investment incentives. That tends to be where you get the most bang for the buck when it comes to, a tax cut that most effectively incentivizes economic growth. So I think it's a great target to aim for. It's just a very difficult target to hit when you look at all of the political considerations that are going to complicate the debate.
Right. So just as a side note, the 333 plan does, of course, remind some of us who have been around for a long time of Herman Cain's 2012 campaign, the 999 plan, which is different provisions, but it sounds familiar. Um, so I also wonder if, we've talked about a bunch of stuff that has some of the things that we're talking about were in the 2017 act and they just want to make them permanent. Some of them, like you said, are long-term priorities that go back even earlier for tax reform and just good tax policy as some of our friends see it. And then we've got these kind of unusual policies that just kind of popped up more recently, like the no tax on tips thing, which I, you know, uh, you can be for it, but I never heard anyone like seriously propose that at the national level in my life before before a few months ago. So it was interesting to see that thrown in the mix, and to be endorsed by both parties is even weirder. Um, so do you think during what is probably going to be a long-term contentious debate process going through again, especially with a very uh, tiny majority, functional majority in the House, are we going to see any other kind of like crazy curveballs or eccentric proposals or kind of weird stuff tossed into the mix that will um, kind of upset the apple cart on what everyone thinks is going to happen. Is Trump famously impulsive, right? Often comes up with non-standard ideas. What his fans love about him, but because of that, it's not going to be the sort of Paul Ryan white paper, right, where everyone kind of knows what's going to happen ahead of time. So, do you see any kind of weird stuff getting tossed into the mix here?
Yeah, I see like two different potentials for that. One is if the push for like a permanent universal tariff is like a very real part of the debate. I think we could see an opportunity to turn that into something more like what we saw originally asked for in the early TCJA days, looking at like a cash flow tax, a destination-based cash flow tax at the federal level. So rather than just imposing a new universal tariff and then doing TCJA, like trying to combine those two, but doing it in a more neutral way with that border adjusted cash flow tax. So I think that's one way the debate could go a bit unexpected if the tariff ask really becomes a big part of it. The other place where we could see just like weird, quirky things pop up is if the deficit pressure leads to a lot of weird budget gimmicks. So you could see playing around with different provisions that the TCJ changed, like the P's limitation, limitations on itemized deductions. The AMT could come back into play, different things there, weird sunsets, maybe tips is included, but only for like 4 years, just different things like that to meet the budget requirements and the political requirements needed to get the votes.
All right, we will see. We will see where it goes. I mean, as someone on Twitter who likes fun news, I would love to see some eccentric, wild, crazy proposals for my own entertainment. But hopefully, not too many wild, crazy proposals for you to have to do model rounds and analysis of,
Keep it
especially
simple.
especially if they're announced one week and then abandoned the next week.
Uh,
All right. Well, we will wait and see, and when, and hopefully maybe we can have you back on when Congress actually adopts a brand new comprehensive tax reform. We can see we might have to pass it to see what's in it.
yeah. That'd be great to come back on.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Erica, for being with us today. And before we go, tell listeners where they can find all of your stuff out there on the internet.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter or X. My handle is Erica D. York. And then, of course, taxfoundation.org is where you can find all of our research and data and analysis.
All right. Thank you so much, Erica, for being with us.
Thank you.